its initiative in the Passages Project long back, where we really felt that globally we need to maybe more sharpen and deepen our lens as we look into the advancing our journey, not only our journeys, but also the pace of it. How do we really gallop the pace? Because we have lost a lot of time. COVID gave us a lifetime learning that how things can roll back as well. With all these things, I think the lens of social norms, the lens of gender norms becomes much more critical. And hence, this platform globally brings together the collective knowledge, learning, and the experience, and the questions that are still remaining unanswered. And today is one of this forum where we are really trying to look into that presence of social norms and maybe absence of social norms as well may have really jeopardized our lives. We have to really unravel and how these things are working or not working. And within the domain of social norms, the gender norms is another arrow which just makes the life more complex. There has been a lot of efforts to look into social norms from different perspectives. We have seen the empowerment frameworks, we have seen some of the social norms framework, but today we felt that how does it work with the non-adult life? How does it frames when the individual is minor by legal terms, when the individual is still shaping up its thinking and all those things. So hence, today's thing is much more critical when we talk about agency, when we talk of social norms, how are we shaping it up? We have been talking about children, and our literature, our knowledge tells us that children as young as 2 years old have already shaped up their gender understanding. They already know what is gender in this society. So when the children at 2 years old have a lot of perceptive learning in their brains, but may not have that sort of expressions, and which keep on then more and more strengthening and getting strong in their minds, it is very difficult for us then to understand, do we really understand them? Do we really know how to learn them? I think there is a lot of questions that still needs to be remain unanswered. There is a lot of questions that we really have figured out that is this the question also. I think we also need to have find out where are the questions. So not taking much time, today is kind of the Learning Collaborative is a star-studded evening where we have many subject matter experts who have been doing in the work in the domain of human development for past many more years. And we would invite them to share their experiences, share their questions. What are they grappling with at the level since the last so many years and so many decades they are in the sector? So I would very first welcome Dr. Abhijit Pathak. Abhijit Pathak is not a new face to the sector, but still I would like to introduce him. Sir, very welcome to this evening, to this event. We look forward to listening to your learnings and listening to the questions that you would like the development sector, the social norm sector to further deep dive. So Dr. Abhijit has 20 years of public health experience in India, in Southeast Asia. And currently he is the family planning, gender and youth country lead and chief of party with Japaigo in India. And prior to joining Japaigo, Dr. Pathak was with Gates Foundation as senior program officer and managing family planning related investments for the country. And he has a long history of experience, definitely, which we can share in the chat as well. But I would like to invite Dr. Pathak, if he can share his thoughts and a kind of keynote to this entire address today. Over to you, Dr. Pathak. Thank you.
Thank you, Sushmita. I hope you can hear me clearly. And thank you to PCI and the Social Learning Collaborative and the organizers. I think it's a great, sort of opportunity. And as you yourself said, it's really a tricky keynote for me to deliver because of the really, sort of opposing views and concepts that today we are going to discuss. And so I am actually going to raise a few questions today that I hope that the moderators for each of the breakout sessions and for each of the groups that will be discussing further can pick those questions up and can really have the experts answer them. And then I would love to then be informed and learn from those experts, because this topic itself. And so let me dive directly into the keynote. So I have worked a long time now in the fight or the friction between the norms and the age space. So for some of the viewers who may be new to both these words, and very simply, without sort of complicated definition, my functional definitions both these terms. So social norms is essentially the standards and benchmarks by which the society expects you to behave, react, and to take action. Uh, I repeat, this is how the society accepts, expects you to do. And so what the society expects keeps changing. Um, so norms keep changing and they're fluid in nature and they do take some time to change, but they do change. And then we come to the next word, which is agency. Now, agency is actually the quite opposite. Agency is the ability for an individual to decide how they want to act, how they want to react, and how they want to behave. And so, in the very first phrase of today's critical conversation, social norms versus agency, we have already entered into a very, very old and frictional, sort of debate. Um, while on one hand, there's society which expects me to behave in a certain way, and then there is something inside me that exerts itself and makes me choose on my own how I want to behave. And then today's conversation becomes even more critical because we have added a third layer of children on it. And that's going to really complicate today's situation. And the reason for that is that not only are we now going to talk about the friction between what the society expects us to behave and what the voice inside us tells us to behave, but we are now going to talk about this in service of children's rights. Now, child rights is a space again which is a very complicated one. So let me simplify some of those complications for the audience and for the group as well. The guiding document for many of us development practitioners in this space for child rights is the Convention of the Rights of Children, and many other documents that flowed from it. One of the problems with all of these documents is that they define children as a homogeneous group. And what I mean by a homogeneous group is that they define a 17-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 2-year-old, all of them as children. And so obviously there are tensions there as well. The other thing that the child rights community and dialogues and publications often will tell you is that this group or this cohort of population who we call children are to be protected. So the Child Rights Convention also, if you look at it, out of the 50 articles that it has, it starts off and ends with, the language of protecting a child, protecting a child, protecting a child, protecting a child. And today we are discussing agency. And those are polarities. If I keep protecting you, and keep molding you into how the society expects you to behave, then how do I let that voice inside you grow? And how do I let the child and what the child wants, how the child wants to behave, come out and shine through? And so the friction between social norms and agency is further complicated when we talk about children and child rights. And so, and these polarities are actually contained even within the Child Rights Convention. So, for example, if you look at the Article 12, Article 13, Article 14 of the Child Rights Convention, it says, well, children have the right to form their own opinions, children have the right to express themselves, children have the right to, have their own sort of expression and interests and opinions on certain things. Indeed, even Article 16, I think, talks about how judiciary should include the voices of children whenever there is a case or a legal issue which involves them. So we all know that in divorce cases, for example, judiciary would ask the child, um, uh, which parent would the child want to live with, and so on. And so this is an acceptance of the evolving capacities of a child, which the Child Rights Convention takes into account. But it still does not, I think, give space for inclusion of developing agency in a child. And I think so development of this agency against the social norm backdrop requires us and the development community to enter into this frictional about is our perspective towards children only about protection, or is it also about empowerment, and is it also about building agency? And is it an either or debate, or is it that we can coexist, that we can protect as well as empower? And then how do we make sure that the social norms that exist today are not so deafening as to drown down the voices of children and what they want and how they want to behave, which is the agency component? And then how do we make sure that the voices of these children and young people and how they want to behave and what their opinions is reflected and heard enough by the society so that the norms actually change? Because this friction between the norms and the agency is what leads to norm change ultimately. And so my questions to the group are actually these: do we think of child rights as something that is homogeneous, or do we think that a 16 or 17-year-old child is different than an 8-9-year-old child? And if that is so, can we make sure that our publications and versions reflect that heterogeneity within children? The second, do we really want, and what are the ways and mediums through which we can enter into a frictional debate of how can a child's agency be developed and the voice be heard, even if it is against the prevalent social norm for children? And so that would bring us to the second question of how can social norms and a child's agency both be programmed for by the development community? And I think that's the second question I would urge all the moderators to discuss about. And the third is that the evolving capacities of a child, which is a paradigm that is well accepted by the Child Rights Convention, when it comes to certain things which are at loggerheads with the law, for example. And I'll give you the example of, you all are experts on this, but let me give you the example of the POXO Act. So the POXO Act is a result of years of effort by child rights advocates, and it is for protection of children. But it also paints all children, even those who are 16 or 17-year-old, with the homogeneous brush of being called a child, and thus only talk about protecting. Do not talk about the fact that 17-year-olds may have aspirations, needs, and desires to experiment sexually, to have relationships. And is that wrong? Is that illegal? Indeed, some social norms today in some cities might say, well, no, I have a 17-year-old daughter who has a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and that's fine. And so social norms are also changing at the same time. But the legal system still continues to fight that battle. And so that's my sort of third inquiry and question that I will urge all the moderators to say. But having raised all these questions, I once again, thank the organizers for really organizing a conversation on such a critical topic. And even if you had not added the child rights part, it was already a very critical conversation about the friction between social norms and individual agency. But then by adding the child rights part to it, you've really put on layers of complications on this. And I credit you for that, because it is through these nuanced and complicated conversations that the development community can come to a consensus, to a path ahead, to make sure that we are not stifling our children, that under the name of protection, we are not drowning down their voices, that we are not choking them, that we are making sure that systems exist to help our young children flourish and blossom into the true potential that they have. And in doing so, how can they inform the society? How can they play their part in changing the norms? And how can we distinguish within children of where protection is needed, which it is needed, and where is the need for space to express agency? And so, with those words, I will end, but I look forward to the breakout sessions and the discussion. Back to you, Sushma.
Thank you, Dr. Pathak. I think this was very provoking, the questions that you have given, and I'm sure our moderators have also noted it down. And this is going to be very interesting because we all are evolving the way we are now, getting more and more clear in how do we want to see this intersectionality of these terms now. And maybe I'll just quickly ask if there can be hand raised by our participants if you want to quickly comment or question Dr. Pathak, because then you will have, all of us will have more time to discuss with our other subject matter experts about these things in details. I would like to now open if there are any hand raised in the audience. But I think, Dr. Pathak, you have really raised some of the critical issues that, yes, children are not homogeneous. And it's not only by age, it's by their residential context, it's by their entire socio-ecosystem, it's by their humanitarian or development spaces where they are, the kind of abilities they have. So I think the life of child is very complex. And given that a child as young as 2 years old has already perceived what is gender, has already maybe started choosing even which toys he or she should play with. So it is very essential. And I think that's where the complexity comes, because the communication lines are different. The adult may not have the right communication channels to interact with that level of the child's mental abilities. And I think that's a big question that comes to on the development sector of our practitioners and the researchers, that how do we really figure out the responses to all these things? And it would be really interesting that, when we are dealing with issues like the education, the issues like mobility, issues like, the early marriage and the sexuality issues that you brought up, that how do we really put it all together? So great. I am not seeing any hand raised from anybody, but I would like to request if the moderators today, if you have any questions to Dr. Pathak. So Dr. Pathak, can I ask you a follow-up question if you have the answer? Like within your example, would you like to talk a little bit more of the diversity of the issue, and a little bit more of gaps in terms of measurement that you have, that you would like to also throw here? Because I heard a lot of design and the implementation part, but would you have something more about the measurement part of it as well, where we are talking of scientific evidences?
Yeah, so actually, let me, before I go into the hardcore sort of measurement tactics, etc., which are very, very difficult to actually do. Again, for the group and for the moderators, the strategic questions are extremely important. Even as development community, even if we understand that there is evolving capacities of a child, and like you said, the socioeconomic background also contributes to it. So even an 8-year-old child who's probably grown up in an impoverished background or on a railway platform or in an orphanage has much better capacities to make decisions than perhaps a child who's been brought up in a protected environment, whose entire experience of life has been one of protection. And so there is huge heterogeneity there. But I think the measurement bits really become more and more difficult because of two things. One is the child's own desire for privacy, for confidentiality, for dignity and respect, which are also enshrined in the Child Rights Convention. And so we have to understand what we measure and whether we should record some things or not. And this brings me to the second point, which is also very important when we talk of measurement, is sometimes the legal environment is such that measurement may do more harm. And as development practitioners, I think the first principle we follow is do no harm. And so, for example, like I said, even if I am a practitioner who works in, let's say, adolescents SRHR needs, and maybe through that program, a 17-year-old boy has received, let's say, condoms. Now, even measuring that aspect in itself can put the providers, the programmers, the development community, the children, the parents, all of them at huge risk, because the current law essentially makes it illegal to do this. And because of the prevention element in the POXO Act, any knowledge or inkling of a sexual activity below 18 has to be reported. And so even if you have an inkling, even if you are a counselor who's answering a young person about one of these things, you have to be very, very cautious about how you record and what you record and so on. I'll give you a tactical example which I didn't want to get into. Um, uh, for example, do I record even ages, or do I record age categories? Do I record individual information, or do I not record individual information? And I think the most important thing in this is not the way I framed these questions. Because when you frame such questions, the answers are yes, you can, or no, you can't, and this topic is not as simple as that. So I can't tell you what to record and what not to record, but I can tell you, and you all can decide in your own organizations and projects and processes on how you will decide what to record and what not to record. So you can flowcharts, processes, tactical committees, which include leadership, include counselors, etc., to decide on processes that you will record, to decide which indicators, depending on what kind of work you're engaged in, are safe to record, and the risks have to be and managed. And this not just for the organization, but for the young people involved. And so I think measurement part is not a what question, it's a how question. And the how depends on each activity that we do in service of the young people that we serve and in service of the children that we serve. So that's sort of my short answer, because I suddenly saw a question pop up in the chat.
I think that was really helpful. I have two hand raised, maybe Vikas, if you can go first, and then Hadija.
Yeah, thanks, Sushmita, and thanks, Abhijit, for walking us through the friction world of social norms and agency. I think that's a great context you've laid out with respect to the heterogeneity. So my question is, and like, coming from a researcher, it's like a more research kind of question in saying that even means when the norms and the environment in which is so heterogeneous, when we talk about child rights or adolescent right, measurement of agency should also actually reflect a very contextual understanding of that kind of environment, right? We cannot, sometimes to simplify that we may result in being very top down in telling people that what agency means and things like that. And that's something which is not something we are looking forward to or wanting to measure. So in your experience, how do we tackle the friction of not only means we're going to discuss the friction of social norms and agency, but also, and I think hopefully we'll also discuss about some of the measurement issues, but your thoughts on how do you define or things about agency in a very context specific setting, like maybe in India, in the urban environment, the agency for a 16-year-old is very different from a 16-year-old in a rural. So some thoughts on that would be helpful. Thanks, Abhijit.
So, no, thanks, Vikas. That's an interesting question, because that's one of the things that actually easier in children than in adults, in my experience at least. The reason is that, children in their minds respond much better when you ask them imaginary questions. For each of the question that you may ask, and if the same question is put to an adult, and let me give you probably a non-controversial question. So let's just say, what time do you have dinner? It's a simple question. What time do you have dinner? Or rather, let's rephrase it. What time do you have dinner? Now, if you ask an adult, what time do you have dinner, or what time do you think you should have dinner, and then split that question into exactly two things: the norms part and the agency part, which means when does everybody tell you to have dinner, and the second is, if nobody was telling anything to you, when would you have dinner? And I said this question because this is a very personal question. I have had this, when I was a child, I used to have this fight when my parents would say it's 8:30 or it's 8 or it's 7:30 p.m. in the night. It's time to have dinner, and I would tell them, listen, I don't feel hungry by the clock. I'll eat when I'm hungry. And that was my freedom of expression, and that was my agency to decide. But then obviously there was the norm was more important at that time. But in children, it's easier to do these surveys. In children, it's easier to have this done, and yet the younger the children, the better, because you can actually ask them in an imaginary context. So you ask them the same question by saying, what does your parents, class, and peers tell you in situation X? And what would happen if you were on another planet, if you were in elsewhere, and what would you like to do in this situation? Now, the second part of your question was also very interesting. How does these response vary from context to context? And I think the idea is not to summate these responses of the norm and the agency. Instead, each question has to be, so the difference in each response tells you about the context. So for example, if the difference between when I want to do something and when the society wants to tell, the norm response and the agency response is not too much, you are essentially about a context that is pretty free for the child. The situation is pretty close to what the child would like to do. And you might find this in impoverished backgrounds and in rich backgrounds and so on and so forth. But this could even be in like the example that I told you about, the serious problems of children who survive streets, children who survive in without parents, etc. Now in situations like that, there is very little difference between the normative response and the agency response. So what would you do if there was no influence on you, and what are you going to do? What are people telling you to do? But in situations which are hyper protective urban environments, etc., you would see with children a large difference between the normative response and the sort of imaginary agency response. But that's my short answer to it. You guys are the experts and researchers. This is just from my experience.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pathak. And I think now I would like to steer today's conversation to our next stage of it, where all our participants will get more time to engage and exchange their thinking. And hence, our next segment of today's critical conversation is to have a chat and to have a discussion with our next level of subject matter experts in this regard. And I would like to now introduce our subject level experts, while I really thank Dr. Pathak as well for the keynote and the questions. So I'd like now to also invite Dr. Vikas Chaudhary, if you can just put on your video to the team here. So Dr. Vikas is a medical graduate and social epidemiologist by training. And in Sambodhi, he is the public health evaluation lead, having extensive years of experience in designing and managing evaluations, have worked extensively in South Asia on human behaviors and many other things. I'll just cut short the intros. Next, I would really invite Dr. Aparajita Gogoi, well-known face in the development sector. Dr. Aparajita Gogoi is a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, and currently is the Executive Director for Center for Catalyzing Change, in short C3. And she leads the efforts at C3 to create lasting effects at the grassroots that support gender equity and women's and girls' access to highest quality for their life improvements. And may I also introduce Sudha Nayan. Sudha is the Director for Capacity Building at New Concept in India. She is a social and behavior change expert and a lead subject matter trainer on SBC. And with that, I would also tell all the participants here that we are going to break out in 3 groups. And I think we have taken the liberty of breaking out in 3 groups, and where we would be facilitated by our subject matter experts to discuss the questions again, that how do we see social norms and agency come together to really facilitate the access to social justice for children and adolescents. And I think the question that Dr. Abhijit also mentioned, that how do we really do that, given that children are not homogeneous? There is a life stage, there is a contextual difference, and many other things. And how do we really make sure that the design and the implementation and the measurement part really take care of the differences, where we want to have them agency, but we want to keep a lot of agency with the adults ourselves. So the question is being pasted on the chat box as well. And may I request Vineha to take care of the breakout rooms?
I'll now open the breakout rooms. Please join the breakout room you're assigned to, and we'll carry on the discussion there.
And the participants in the French will stay in the main room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, let me just check how many people are here.
Participants in this main room, can you hear me?
Yeah, I think we can start. Yes.
Yeah, hello. Okay, so maybe we can do a quick round of introductions here within ourselves. I hope all of you had really put up your intros in the comment box, in the chat box. Am I right? I'd like to pose the very first question that, how do you see social norms and agencies are really intersecting with the child rights? If that's the biggest question, and if someone can start with that, responding with their experiences.
Hi, this is Shashwat from PCI, and we are working very closely with the adolescent. And I think the point which we are raising here, that how social norms, can contribute in, probably grabbing opportunities for an adolescent, or maybe in, some other way. So I think this social norm can be catalyst for adolescents' development, or sometimes it may be hurdle also. Sometimes it creates problem also. Like, I would like to share one of my experiences when I was working with some of the children of CNCP. So in one of my organization, they were employed somewhere, I mean, before 18 years of age, and they were earning for their family, and most of them are from those kind of family where nobody other earning member was there in the family. And we as an organization, we collaborated with the legal services and police departments. We rescued them, and we rescued around 150 children from different locations. And when we visited their home for doing a home investigation report and in developing individual care plans and all those things, then we realized that most of the children were not belongs to that age group which was listed there in their identification card, maybe in Aadhaar card or maybe some other card, because uh, they most of them are from the marginalized community, and they were not having any identity at that point of time. And one thing I observed, that in whole village around 120 children were there, and all of them, they had their birthdays on 1st of January. So like they went to the Aadhaar person, the organization or authority who were preparing Aadhaar and all, and they allocated the same date of birth to each and everyone. So my question is that I sorry, I'm taking more time in this, but my question is that what we can do if that kind of situation arrive in front of us, where uh, legally we are doing right, but when you think sensitive with the sensitivity and all those things, then you feel that no, this rescue has not should not be done, because they were earning bread and butter, and now family will struggle in arranging all those things. So, and this is the social norms of that society, that when children grown up and when they are looks that they can earn, they can work irrespective of their age and all, so the parents send their children for employment and all. So my question is that how will deal with this kind of situation?
Sure, sure. Thank you, Shashwat. And I would love if any else participant please respond, react to this situation on this question. But at the same time, we have a set of trade areas, for example. So I hope I am being audible, and I would like to repeat my question. And it's more of a very introductory basic question, that how do participants feel? We just heard Dr. Abhijit Pathak sharing the verticals together. How do we see adolescence? How do we see social norms? And then the bringing in the agency thing. So I would really request if members have to say that, how do they see this together, or how do they deal with it? What are some of the questions? Yes, I'll also type the question here, but it is more an open thing, that, what is your reaction and response to that how do you see social norms and agency comes together to ensure social justice to children and adolescents? I have also put the question on the chat box. I hope you are able to unmute yourself and react and respond to this thing. Am I audible? If anyone can just unmute themselves or at least respond that yes, I am audible.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay.
May I add, ma'am, Shashwat here.
Yes, please.
Ma'am, I think when an adolescent or children have their agency and know how to grab the opportunities, and if social norms is also supporting in grabbing those opportunities, then I think it brings social justice for the children. And but sometimes it may happen that social norms are also stopping those adolescents to grab those opportunities. Like for example, as Dr. Abhijit rightly said, that I have a right of I have a right that when I want to go for dinner. I mean, it's not that somebody come and tell us ki, you have to have dinner at this point of time. So I think these social norms are, as I already mentioned, that sometimes it work as a catalyst and sometimes it create hurdle also. So I think we'll have to map all those norms and all those social phenomena which are going in our local community, so that we can merge those social norms and we can use those norms as an advantage for adolescents. So I think this is mapping of those social norms in support of adolescents will be a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Great. So, Sashwat, this is very interesting things. And maybe do you want to go to the implementation room to really join the discussion? Maybe I can assign you there.
Yes, I can go, ma'am.
Okay. So, there are already understanding those and agency for children. Having the talk to them, having the So may I ask you, Florence, are you comfortably doing it? Is there any question to this thing? Because I'm not sure why I'm finding many of the people not in any rooms. Ajay Kumar. Florence, can you hear me now? I've come into the French translations. Can you say something? Because I can't hear you. Because yes. Yes, I can hear you. So how many more people are in the French translations? I know Hippo is there.
Yes, I'm there.
No. I know Hippo did share that he is there. So it would be good if you can, mention to ask that how do you see the relations between agency and social norms and children? How do you see these connections?
Can you repeat, please? I can go in French.
Yes, yes, yes. No, no, he can speak in French, and absolutely, I want him to be comfortable in French.
OK, merci beaucoup, Sashmita. Selon moi, au regard de ce qui a été déjà développé par les panélistes, la question des normes sociales et de l'agentivité est qu'au niveau des enfants, généralement, dans un environnement assez moins contraignant, les normes sociales s'apparentent un peu plus, sont un peu pratiquement plus acceptées et très proches de l'agentivité. Mais généralement, elles sont du moins différentes. Mais lorsque l'enfant vit une situation, il vient d'une crise comme ça, les normes sociales et l'agentivité sont quasi identiques. Donc, c'est ce que j'ai pu comprendre. Et à mon sens, l'expérience que j'ai eu à faire avec les questions de droits de l'enfant, de santé sexuelle et reproductive en milieu adolescent, c'est que la discussion sur l'agentivité, la volonté ou la capacité de l'enfant à prendre des décisions, elle est beaucoup plus motivée lorsqu'on garantit la confidentialité. Je suis d'accord avec le panéliste lorsqu'il parle de la confidentialité. Et l'expérience que j'ai, c'est que nous utilisions généralement le scorecard evaluation, qui est une approche développée par Serge et qui permet aux enfants d'exprimer au fond de ce qu'ils ont. Donc, ça nous permet quelque part de mesurer l'agentivité des enfants. Et concernant les normes sociales, bon, là aussi, la discussion après le système de votation, parce que le scorecard, ça permet à l'enfant de voter de façon anonyme et on anime maintenant la discussion pour comprendre maintenant la jonction entre les normes sociales et l'agentivité. Donc, voici ma petite contribution. Je suis d'accord avec lorsqu'on dit qu'on garantit la confidentialité des enfants, ils s'expriment et on peut mesurer leur agentivité par rapport aux normes sociales. Voilà, donc ce que je peux dire, c'est cela. Merci à vous.
Yeah, sure, sure. I'll now go to the main room and let's see, because I do see that there are still people who haven't joined any breakout rooms if there is any issue there. Yeah. Hippo, can you just put down your points in the chat box as well?
In French or in English?
Any. Even if you put in French, I'll just Google translate it. No issues on that. Thank you. Hope you had a nice discussion, and I'm sure. I know the team size was little more than that could have been managed. But many thanks to our subject matter experts who have done their level best to do it. And as the time is really short, I would now request Aprajita, Dr. Gogoi, to, if you can, unmute yourself and share not only what your groups have opined, but also add to some bit of your experience of how you see the connection between the social norms and agency and the children and adolescents social justice. Over to you, Dr. Gogoi.
Thank you, and let me know when my 5 minutes are up so that I don't eat into other people's time. Okay, yes. So thank you so much. We started by talking a bit about what are norms, how are legal, social, moral norms different, what are social norms, what is a simple definition of agency, and how do the two intersect. In the discussions, we asked the question about what could be some of the priorities, research priority, implementation priority gaps. And I think the participants talked about, we need, since we all agree that norms have an impact, a huge impact on young people, young individuals, children and adolescents, if we could look at mapping out social norms that have positive impact and help bring those. There was a little bit of discussion about how sometimes norms can conflict with the reality, legal norms, child labor, child rescue, all of that. There was also a bit of conversation about how definition of agency is complicated, but all of us agreed that whenever there are social norms, the impact of social norms being much more on girls who grew up in an environment of disadvantage than boys. So the severe lack of agency that girls suffer because the social norms about women and girls are so predefined and so strong and robust in our society. We also talked about how sometimes social norms either go away or make a resurgence when there are unforeseen circumstances. For example, the COVID pandemic, girls learning loss, staying back, not being able to come back to school, and also being married off. There was a lot of conversation about intersectionality and how difficult it is to unravel. But there was agreement about how it is really important to gain insight into the impact of similar social norms, but on young people hailing from different socioeconomic, geographic backgrounds. And as part of my own learning from our work, we have seen how when we have a curriculum or we have an intervention design or there are social norms intertwined, the same cookie cutter approach doesn't really work. Young people are not homogeneous, they're heterogeneous. When we try to reach out and work around social norms or agency of young people, there has to be different strategies for those who are, for example, not in formal education, those who are displaced, or married young people with disability, or even young parents. I think it's really also important for us to increase our own understanding and comprehension of how marginalization of certain groups of adolescents are also very unique. They have unique social norms under which they live. They have unique social identities. And how do we look at that? And one kind of a recommendation could be that we do comparative research across different regions and countries so that we get some insights into norms which are universal and norms which are culturally specific, and then look at social norms and agency building strategies. I also want to kind of talk about the fact that we've always struggled with definitions, but the need to tailor some of these definitions and, more importantly, interventions to specific context. Again, in our country, in South Asia, in many other countries also, we often need to look at the gender disparities in agency. In our breakout, we talked about, again, how adolescent girls sometimes, or women, suffer the brunt of social norms because traditional gender expectations, social norms have a much bigger impact on girls' agency and decision making than on boys. And norms have a much more negative impact on their ability to exercise their agency. But I think overall, at the end, I would like to say that it's really important to do implementation research on the effectiveness of interventions and programs which are aimed at promoting social norm change in agency in young people, but be very cognizant that we are using data-driven insights to refine and improve strategies over time. Because implementers like us really need some of these evidence which says this is what is has proven to lead to norm change and increasing of agency. But then I think all of you will agree that the relationship between social norm and agency is very complex and multifaceted, it's dynamic, it is context dependent. So whatever research, whatever priorities we undertake has to also take into account all of this. I also feel that we have seen some studies on social norm change and agency, but these are they focus on short-term outcomes. I'm not very sure how many longitudinal or long-term assessments are there, which really look at how the interventions can affect young people's belief, behavior, agency over time. A second recommendation from me is to look at intersectionality in its widest definition of how it intersects or influences the experience of social norms and agency. My third recommendation is also to look at cultural variations, because social norms and agency are very much influenced by cultural variation. So we need to do some cross-cultural research to understand how social norms and agency varies across societies. We can also look at, what are some of the barriers to agency. I think in our gut we know, but some research would be really good and useful for us to design our interventions, which takes into barriers, which is economic, it's family dynamics, it's social norms, it's peer pressure, cultural expectations. Needless to say, I think there was a question posed to Abhijit in the beginning about measuring some of this. I don't think we have the answers today, but that's also really important. So I think I am going to stop here, but just to let all of you know.
I think this is very interesting, Dr. Gogoi. And thanks.
I just want to add one more sentence that, Vikas and I today, we are also part of the Agency for All project, and we are very much looking forward to working with all of you in really understanding and defining agency, but more importantly for me, designing programs that really tackle social norms and agency. Back to you, Shushmita.
Thank you. Thank you. I will actually quickly hand over the mic to Dr. Vikas, if you can, and just use five minutes.
Sure, Shushmita. I'll try to wrap up before, because I think a lot of discussions that Aprajita kind of alluded to were some of that happened in our group as well. So I'll start with what the group discussion focused around. I think we got a little bit into the discussions around agency and what does that mean with respect to the definition, as well as what aspects of it what are the different kinds of agency we are thinking about, which are which we were discussing in light of child rights and adolescent rights. A lot to do with adolescent rights is what the discussion went on. But it was quite interesting that the group used some of the terms for agency as goal setting. Then there was a term used as voices. Then there were things about how decision making, intentional behaviors. So a lot of our discussions, in fact, revolved around the fact that it's actually not only the ability to act, but also the ability to have express your goals according to and have those goals set according to the choices that you're planning to make, and then ability to decide to act on those choices or voice out those opinions or voice out those those are also the spectrum of agency that we should be thinking about while we are referring to agency, and then thinking about measuring agency in a lot of the interventions which may be focusing around norm shifting or some of the social behavior change interventions that we are thinking about. We actually navigated into the field of is agency individual, or can we also think about collective agency, or things like organizational agency, things like community agencies and stuff like that. And I think the group kind of discussed a little bit, not very deep, because I think we didn't have time, but it's a very interesting concept that we were talking about, that actually agency could be at an individual level. And you could think about ways to measure it at an individual level, but there is also the existence of something called institutional agency or a community agency or a group agency, like I think the example that was spoken about was group of health workers. In child and adolescent, it could be the peer educators that you're talking about, and how that sometimes actually influences individual agency in a way that it improves your knowledge or critical consciousness about something. But it may also have an effect sometimes which could be impeding the fact that you are able to intentionally act out your behavior. Like I think the example given was sometimes around peer pressures, working against, let's say, a goal that you have set, a goal you have set for yourself, purely because in that peer pressure you may feel stigmatized if you're articulating that goal, or if you're deciding to act on that goal with respect to any behavior that young people or children may be thinking about. And that may actually sometimes be detrimental in actually being able to influence your individual agency. So I think that was a very interesting conversation and a lot to ponder about with respect to this complicated relationships within different types of agency that exist, or if we are thinking about building agencies. Finally, I think our intersections around social norms and agency was somewhat in line with what Aprajita spoke about in her group, and also about her own experiences of working in interventions that have focused around these, and how complicated that behavior, how complicated that relationship is, not only with respect to who influences what. Is social norm an influencer of agency? Yes, I think that may seem logical according to a lot of people in the group. But it could also be a scenario in which sometimes the agencies can be used for norm shifting. And how do you then think about what's the intermediate variables? What are these intermediate pathway mechanisms? What are those things that we are talking about is kind of interesting. And finally, I think the group did discuss a little bit around how do we study agency, how do we measure agency, and I think we did get a couple of hints in terms of measurement, with saying that sometimes we can use local, we can actually do some formative work around thinking about what do local terms, what do agency mean in local terms. I think there is hardly a word that we can think about in our languages which would correctly describe agency, and I think that's often we as measurement and as researchers we fall into the trap of taking a measurement of agency from another high income setting and trying to put it in our settings, which sometimes work, which sometimes does not work, and we actually fall. I mean, I've had experience of falling flat on those. And also using scenarios to think about measuring agency, and Abhijit had given us a great example, and specifically with respect to young people and children, that way of working and measuring agency works. And even the interaction of social norms and agency works in like asking what is it that the parents want you to do or school teachers want you to do, and what is it that if you were to be in an alternate world where there were no rules around school teachers and around certain behaviors, how would your behavior look like? So I think these were some of the things that we discussed. And over to you, Sushmita. Sorry for taking, I think, a little bit more time.
No, I think we really wanted to accommodate everybody's, but there would be time when we will be much more dwelling upon the social norms and agency piece. But I'll hand over the mic to Sudha, if you can share your thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you. I think if I can say, we started our discussion by the norm set by Dr. Pathak. So we adhered to the questions. We did not discuss. We assumed that, participants, because we knew, as a moderator, we didn't discuss on agency and social norm, but we went away straight to the questions. So the level of discussions were slightly different from what the first two groups presented. So we looked at, yes, it is not a homogeneous group. And we looked at even RKSK looks at 10 to 14 and 15 to 19. So we sort of focused, I must say, we didn't have enough time to even look at a certain age group, but yes, the appreciation that the context, the rural upbringing, urban upbringing, there is a difference in the way they are able to exercise their agency. First recognize that agency, be able to exercise that agency. So that recognition was felt across the group. And importantly, I think from Nigeria, what was shared was also sometimes our perception of risk behaviors as adults is very different. So our friend shared an example of how they were doing a study and parents were not willing to accept that, and younger age group child has that kind of risk behavior. So how do you really even negotiate when you're doing a study? So that there is acceptance of what the findings are. So experience around that also showed the need to have nuanced approach. So that really it is not just what, but how we do the exercise, especially research that becomes very critical. So recognition that this is important to be understood and looked. There was some elementary discussion on individual agency and collective agency. There were examples of early child marriage in India, and we see that there are girls who get married and yet limited collective agency to change that social norm. And there was some discussion on how participation of children across the different age group is so necessary to even recognize or build the agency at an individual level, at the agency at collective level. So I think, again, recognizing that complexity of issues. And one recognition was, when we talk of social norm and agency in abstract, it becomes very difficult because the context is different. Children under parental care will have very different agencies to exercise, like what Dr. Pathak was saying. Maybe children who are not in the parental care or protective environment may be very life smart. They can take decisions. Self-efficacy is very high. So we were not able to look at all the intersectionality of, normative expectations, sanctions, self-efficacy, because it's far more complex. I think what I would say, the group we were able to understand the complexity. And one thought which emerged was maybe it should be rooted around a certain issue so that agency can get defined and clarified better. And we understand the social norms, because the same social norm which is very restrictive can sometimes lead to certain skill sets which actually help you move ahead in life. So it is a far more complex issues that we are dealing with. And again, how becomes very important. At what age? There was very some initial thoughts on maybe it is good to work with a younger age group also to build their agency, so that because the friction between social norm and agency gets maximized when you're young adults, between 15 to 19, as we see in society. So these were some, I would say there was no conclusion. In fact, we had to abruptly end our conversation because of lack of time. So I think these are some broad areas, but yeah, it is very multifaceted. It is very cultural specific. I think one recognition across all the participants was we live in an age full of information. We live in an age where there is access to information. Again, that is varied. There are cultural specific norms. And I think all these just add layers of complexity to something, even our own understanding of what really norms are. How do we redefine agencies? And again, it has to be issue-based so that we understand, are able to do, like the earlier two speakers, moderators mentioned, that the need to decode and defragment only to understand them better so that programming can be sharper.
Absolutely.
I don't want to repeat what was said earlier about.
Absolutely. I think in today's conversation we learned that yes, this is a right mix, but it is quite a dangerous and not yet understood. And I would like to actually now invite Dr. Paul Bukuliki, and Dr. Paul is joining us from Nigeria, and he is professor at Makerere University. And Dr. Paul, thank you for joining us. And I think now I would come to you, as you are researching on agency And how do you see in today's discussion, and what are the kind of like, again, some questions and triggers that you would like the audience here to keep pondering upon till we come back again on discussing this critical issue combination? Over to you, Dr. Paul.
Thank you so much. I have had a chance really to listen into the breakout sessions and the summary that has been provided by the moderators. And I would say this has been very, very exciting. And it has been a learning curve for me in terms of the very interesting ideas that have been shared. Just of course to note that yes, even in our research as we try to study agency, we have seen that it is difficult to study agency without thinking about social norms that operate within the environment where the children, adolescents, women, and men do operate, because norms very much impact on the decisions that these younger people do, on the goals that they set, but also on them having voice and autonomy to be able to even articulate their goals. So that strong nexus related to agency the norms definitely becomes important, and sanctions. And that still, this could be embedded in formal and informal institutions and produced and reproduced through social interaction. So you can see that it is difficult to imagine a society where younger people are not affected by norms. And of course, it is good also to appreciate the fact that norms also don't operate in isolation. They are within a system of other structural factors that we need to take into account. These structural factors could be laws, could be policies, could be access to services, among others. So as even we think about norms and agents, we also need to appreciate the context even within which both these two very important issues operate in a system nested into other structural factors and systems that impact on norms and agency. But beyond that is also to understand that much as we talk about social norms, there is a subset of those norms called gender norms that, about masculinity or femininity, that expresses expected behavior of people of a particular gender. And often of a certain age, like adolescents, in a given social context. So I liked it really when people were emphasizing the issue of context, because norms and agency, again, play out in specific contexts. And they may play a role in shaping women and men or children's often unequal access to resources, freedoms, voice, power, agency, self-worth, self-efficacy, among others. So I really appreciated this discussion very much. And of course, going back to agency, I appreciated the fact that most of you were discussing agency as something nested within the broader empowerment process, where individuals, strive to expand their aspirations, set goals, and gain great autonomy to allow them to achieve their goals in the context of both positive norms that might support their process of exercising agency, but also the harmful norms that might act counter to their ability to exercise agency. And I also, listening to the feedback, was able to see that when people are talking about agency, innovating ways to speak about agency in less abstract ways is important, given already its complexity. So for example, if you are in a small village in somewhere in Delhi, which local terms do you, when speaking to younger people, children, adolescents, about their sexual and reproductive health rights, how do you speak about agency in terms of their capacity to make purposeful choices, but also navigate the external factors, opportunity structures that create an enabling environment within which they pursue their interests and convert their behavior intentions around SRHR into action? So I really liked that, but I also could hear from the groups that issues around autonomy, voice, self-efficacy to make decisions, but also to believe that you can translate those into action was very important. But issues of self-worth, self-esteem also seemed to be important as younger people navigate their journeys. But that discussion that especially in Vikas's group came around the issue of when looking at adolescents, for example, can we envision collective agency whereby adolescents as peers come together to work together to set goals and walk through achieving those goals? Maybe let us take an example of it is not allowed in a school to discuss about contraception, yet younger people in the school, you know, some of them are already sexually active. If they come together to find ways through which they can speak about that, that becomes some kind of collective agency. And we need to understand how we can measure the way collective agency operates. But more important, and I would like to underscore this, is the issue that when we are looking at adolescents, this is like our keynote spoke. This is a heterogeneous group that has different social identities. I could be an adolescent, but illiterate, of a different race, from a marginalized race or caste. I might be from a rural area. I might be a refugee. I might have a disability. So we are dealing with the adolescents that have different social identities that are playing out, and these might influence their agency. So taking that lens of intersectionality as we look at agency and how people interface with norms to negotiate for more autonomy, voice, self-efficacy, to make decisions and to convert their intentions into action is extremely important. I just want to really say that I think this was such an exciting topic, and that there is a lot that we continue to learn as we try to think about this relationship between agents and social norms. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to Dr. Paul. I think that was a great summarization of today's, and I do see we are just crossed time. So I would like to really see that today the critical conversation has really, like, caved out a lot of interesting questions, which really shows that the development sector has to now struggle with many more sharp questions to really see that where are we in terms of shaping up our so-called legal minors, who are legally minors, who are about to be adults, and when we are working so much in the empowerment and gender equality and all those things, I think there's so much to do. And the social norms lens is very essential, as we have constantly reminded ourselves that the presence and absence of norms is also very essential to remember that, if there are absence of norms, then there is a lot of confusion that what to do and what not to do, what is right and not. So I would like to go to the thanks section. And first of all, I would really like to thank Rebecca Lundgren to be here all the way from West Coast of USA at a very early hours, who has been really motivating and inspiring for us to do this collaboration, to do this critical conversations. I'd like to thank Hunter and Princess from our team to be constantly guiding us to do this thing. I would definitely like to thank Dr. Paul, Sudha, Dr. Gogoi, and Dr. Chaudhary for their brilliant subject matter expert facilitation and their comments. Definitely, again, thanks to Dr. Pathak for the very beginning keynote and triggering the questions and the discussions. Many thanks to Florence, who has done a brilliant French translations for our French audience here. And a lot of thanks to the Social Norms Learning Collaborative and the Agency for All team and their hub coordinator Harish here on the team here. Thanks to Vineha, Mona Lisa, Shrishti, and Cheryl from the South Asia Collaborative to have really supported to do this thing. And I must say, before I say thanks, that this event is not the end. This is where our journey continues. We will come back with more, as Dr. Gogoi has mentioned that they are trying to research out some bit of what agency is all about. So Dr. Gogoi, Dr. Chaudhary is going to come back to us with another round of critical conversations where we try to take much more sharper questions and really see how agency can be further deconstructed. So keep looking at our emails, and we have given on the chat box how to join us in our membership so that you get regular updates as well. And with that thing, I would say a very good evening from New Delhi, India, and very good day to all of the people across the globe. And a big thank you to all of you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.